discussing the microbiome. And in particular, we're going to discuss 5 commonly held misconceptions about the microbiome. Now, I assume that everyone has heard the term microbiome before, and maybe not even in a necessarily scientific context, but maybe rather as a buzzword. And that's why we're going to go through 5 misconceptions or myths about the microbiome today. Now, what is the microbiome? The microbiome is the set of organisms that lives on and inside of you. Now, all animals have a microbiome. That is all humans as well as other types of animals. We differ in what our microbiome is made up of, and we might even differ at different times in our lives, as well as different individuals within a species, but we all have microbiomes. Now, when I say the organisms that live on and in us, I'm referring to bacteria, some archaea, as well as single-cellular eukaryotes and all of those compose the microbiome. So it contains or it specifies a broad diversity of different types of organisms. Now, up front, I'm going to recommend a couple of different resources for really expanding your knowledge on the microbiome. There are 2 books that I recommend. Follow Your Gut by Rob Knight, which is a really nice short text about the microbiome, which covers some interesting topics, including how your diet affects your microbiome and vice versa. And then I Contain Multitudes by Ed Yong is a great book that goes more in depth about the microbiome and his studies on the microbiome. And throughout the presentation, I'm going to show you some neat pictures of bacterial cultures, because I love that kind of stuff. And you'll also see some images of micrographs, that is, images from under a microscope. So we already discussed what the microbiome is, but I just want to point out that, again, not only humans have a microbiome, but other animals as well, and even plants. And so this image on the left here is an image of a magnified image of plant roots and bacteria that are associated with it. And there are some plants that specifically form special organs or special parts of their root tissue to house bacteria. And so if you've ever heard that legumes or other types of or all types of plants that produce beans are good for restoring nitrogen to the soil, that's kind of true, but in reality, it's the bacteria that like to associate with the roots of those plants that actually replenish the nitrogen or the usable nitrogen in the soil. So again, not just humans, not just animals, but also plants as well. All have these microorganisms living in concert with them. And so we're going to see that microbiomes are made up of many different types of organisms. So these 2 images here show that there are many different cell types, and these are not stained images, they are artificially colored, but you can see that they're all different shapes and sizes of microorganisms in these images, and that these different species are living close together and most likely interacting in what metabolites they produce. And we have densely populated areas of our bodies, and that's okay. It's okay to have lots of bacteria in certain areas of an organism. So don't be too squeamish. Guess that could be a myth in itself. So let's start on our 5 misconceptions about the microbiome. Number 1 is that your microbiome controls everything. And I think that there's this kind of search almost for a reason why we do things, or a kind of leading principle. And so at one point, people kind of, or popular culture said that genes control everything that you do and who you could become. And now some popular culture sources are kind of implying that your microbiome controls everything that you do, from your mental state to your weight and your skin health. And that's just not true. Your microbiome will influence certain things about you, including all those areas that I just mentioned, but you influence your microbiome as well. You're not controlled by it. And of course, your genes are going to have interactions with your microbiome, and your experiences will also impact your microbiome. So, for example, how much of a certain type of food you eat, maybe how much vinegar you intake, or how much yogurt or beer, all of those are going to impact your microbiome because they are made with bacteria themselves. Some microbes are going to differ from person to person, and you're never going to have two people who are identical in their microbiome. And we're going to see more about how that correlates with different people in a couple of minutes. And then similarly, or kind of on the other end of the spectrum, if two people have two similar traits, two similar phenotypes, it doesn't mean that they're going to have the same microbial communities. So if you were thinking that your microbiome controls you and influences how you think and whatnot, you could not make that correlation by saying, oh, these two people think alike, or they have the same kind of psychological condition, and then look at their microbes. That's not going to be universal for people with that condition. So number 2 is that your microbiome is looking out for you. Now, that's definitely not true, although I think that we all kind of fall into this way of thinking sometimes. Again, you can make the correlation to how we think about genes sometimes, that our genes are kind of looking out for us and trying to solve problems for us. But our genes and our microbes are not really looking out for us, especially our microbes. So our microbiome is just a set of microorganisms that have hitched a ride on or inside of your body. And they're good at living in the human body, and sometimes we benefit from them, but it's not as if the microbes are not parasites, at least most of them. So they're not trying to keep us alive so that they could live in this human environment for longer. The microbes, many of them, can still live in other environments, so they're not specialized to humans. And even the ones that are specialized to humans, they are evolutionarily more selfish than, than virtuistic. They're not going to just live to help you out. So if, for example, I've heard the thinking that if you don't bathe, or if you don't wash your hair, if you don't wear deodorant, then eventually your microbiome will kind of even things out, and you'll find this natural balance. But your microbiome doesn't care how greasy your hair is. Your microbiome doesn't care how stinky you smell. The microbes are going to do, what's allowing them to multiply, which might be making smells or making oils or whatever. I did want to acknowledge that, humans have outsourced certain functions to microbes. So we use microbes to digest certain foods, a lot of foods, in our digestive tract, but that doesn't mean that we have a codependent symbiotic relationship with microbes, or any microbe in particular. So there are lots of different types of microbes that can help with digestion, and you will probably have different types of microbes in your digestive tract over the course of your lifetime. So again, we don't have one specific microbe that we kind of nourish and allow to grow in our gut. We have lots of different microbes, and so there's no microbe that has that we know of that has evolved specifically to live inside the human gut and help us digest things. And so far as we know, there are not microbes that actively seek out the human environment. All right, number 3. Number 3 is that washing your hands is bad, or that hand sanitizer is bad. So I think that most of us at this current time, and this is being recorded in 2021, most of us are really good friends with hand sanitizer right now. But this was something that was inspired actually by an interaction I had with a kid at a gym. I think that it was probably like a 5-year-old maybe. I was sanitizing my hands after being at the gym, and the child told me that I shouldn't use hand sanitizer because it's bad for your bacteria. And I kind of told the kid, oh yeah, I know that, but it's not bad to sanitize your hands. Your microbiome is resilient. So even if you are using hand sanitizer multiple times a day, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have microbes on your hands. If you're very careful, then you can maintain a relatively sterile environment on the surface of your skin. But as many of us who have worked with bacteria in the lab know, or who have done medical procedures know, is really difficult to stay sterile for any amount of time, especially if you're not in an environment that is sterile. It's good to obviously clean your hands, especially if you've been touching foods or other items that you know have bacteria on them. And just because you sanitize, it doesn't mean that you've gotten rid of all of the bacteria, and it doesn't mean that you've gotten rid of all of the good bacteria. You have, you sanitize your hands, you still have bacteria on your forearms. Don't worry, you're going to get bacteria back on your hands pretty soon. I did want to mention also that nowadays we've been using a lot of alcohol-based hand sanitizers, and those are really good. They're something that bacteria cannot evolve resistance to. However, hand sanitizers and soaps with the chemical triclosan are bad because they do contribute to antibiotic resistance. So bacteria can evolve resistance to triclosan, and then obviously that's bad because we cannot use that as a deterrent for people who are sick or who really need to get rid of a bacterial infection. So there are actually laws against using triclosan at this point. And our alcohol-based hand sanitizers work perfectly fine. Number 4 in our 5 misconceptions. Our microflora only lives in our gut. No, that's definitely not true. Our microbiomes are all over our bodies. Our gut microbiome does play a really big role in our health and our well-being, but it's certainly not the only place where we have microbes. So this image is from one of the early studies on the human microbiome, and it shows a bunch of different body sites or areas of the body that were sampled with sterile swabs where they found bacteria. So pretty much everywhere on the body that they sampled, they found bacteria. And in this image, the bacterial types are divided up by color or indicated by color. If you are familiar with bacterial taxonomy, you'll see that these groups that are associated with the colors are really diverse groups, or really broad groups, so we're not going down to the species level by any means. But you can see that there's a lot of diversity even using these broad groups, which means that we have lots of different types of bacteria in a single site. So we have a bunch of different colors here indicating that there are a lot of different groups of bacteria. And if you look between different sites, especially across different parts of the body, then we see that there's a lot of diversity within an individual as well. And we also know that there's a lot of diversity between, or variation between, individuals in terms of the microbes that they have on their skin, in their gut, in their orifices. In general, you don't have microbes in your body tissue. So if you look at your muscle tissue, you're not going to see microbes. You hopefully don't have many microbes in your blood, but on these sites on the surface of your body, as well as in orifices, including things that we know have protective mechanisms to keep bacteria out, like the inside of your nose, for example, or even your eyes. Your tears have antibacterial components to them. We're going to still find some bacteria, not in large numbers necessarily, but they are there. And then finally, let's move on to the last misconception, and that is that scientists have characterized what a healthy microbiome should look like. So as I kind of said a moment ago, there have been a number of studies on the human microbiome, well over 100 studies looking at all different sites on the body, as well as many different individuals with different diets and from different age groups, etc. Those people no two people have the same microbiome from that first set of people who were tested for their microbiome characteristics. And through time, we also know that your microbiome is going to change. So your microbiome is healthy depending on what is healthy for you. And although you might not be able to look at a microbiome and say, okay, this looks healthy, well, this doesn't. Things that indicate that the person is healthy would be higher diversity in the microbiome. So people who are unwell tend to have low diversity in their microbiome, and they might have a lot of pathogens in their microbiome, or if not pathogens, at least opportunistic pathogens. So bacteria that are there because other bacteria are not there. So if we look at this figure at the bottom here, we see that there are different sites at A, B, C, and D, and we see that there are different individuals indicated by each of these bars, and then again we're seeing different groups of bacteria indicated by the different colors. And the bigger the chunk of the color, the more bacteria of that type they see or we're seeing at that site for that person. And we see that most people have a good amount of diversity at all sites, except for a number of people have low diversity on their backs, which kind of makes sense because your back doesn't come in contact with a lot of stuff. This one person, interestingly, had very low diversity in their nose, which seems like a strange thing. I'm not sure where they're spending time in a very sterile environment. And then this person had a very low diversity of bacteria on their heel. So that could indicate that they had some kind of fungal infection, perhaps, which is really crowding out some types of bacteria. So again, you can't look at any of these and say, oh yeah, this one looks like a healthy microbiome, but you can say, all right, this looks like there's a good amount of diversity, whereas this other individual doesn't have a lot of diversity, or if you compare HV1 here and HV2 here. So a more diverse microbiome would probably indicate a healthier microbiome. And you'll see this if you look at a time series of the same individual. If you look at the microbiome composition when the individual is well versus when they're sick, you'll likely see that there's a more diverse microbiome when the person is well. So for example, I once saw a set of data where the individual actually was sampled during before, during, and after a case of food poisoning, and the microbiome really changed when they were sick, and immediately after, the diversity of their microbiome went way down. And then it took a while for the microbiome to recover, interestingly. So that diversity was added back slowly. So again, one of the things that you might want to do if you want to take care of your microbiome is try and introduce more diversity. If you're looking for probiotics or prebiotics, you might want to try and find ones that have diversity so that you could kind of encourage different types of bacteria to grow in your gastrointestinal tract specifically, because that's usually where we're going to get bacteria if we are consuming things. So I want to finish out not with another misconception, but I did want to show this image and talk a little bit about how we test hypotheses about the microbiome. So this image is actually a biofilm from a dental plaque. So we do have a lot of bacteria on our teeth, even if we brush regularly. I mean, that is why we brush regularly, right? Because bacteria grow really well on our teeth and in our mouth because we put a lot of food in there, right? And the bacteria like to eat the food just as much as we do. But I did want to mention that studying the microbiome is a real challenge because we don't know, or there is no definition really of a healthy microbiome other than it is diverse. And you need to look at a lot of different types of bacteria, not all of which can actually be cultured in the lab in order to look at the microbiome. But we have made some progress. We know that we should see diversity, or should expect to see diversity. We also know that there tend to be some trends, some characteristics of the communities of certain sites, and that certain sites will differ. So for example, all of these sites are along the arm, and we see that they're different than sites up at the top of the face, at the top of the body, and the neck. So again, we have some ideas, some preliminary data and knowledge about the microbiome, but there's still lots to be learned. So I'll leave you with that.